Hi, everyone. Welcome to Free Range Conversations with American Farmland Trust. I'm your host, Greg Plotkin. Today, we're talking about promising opportunities to build resilience on Midwest farms. We're going to dig into soil health, water quality, environmental market opportunities, and actions farmers can take today to help build a brighter tomorrow. I'm really excited to have a couple of our Midwest staff here with us today. We have Jean Brokish, our AFT Midwest Program Manager, and Emily Bruner, our Midwest Science Director. To get started, I'm just going to ask Jean and Emily to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about how they got into this work, and what their role is at AFT. But before we do that, I just want to remind everyone that this is a live conversation. So if you have questions for Jean at any time, just chat it into the comment thread on whatever platform you're watching, and we'll do our best to get to them on the call today. So Jean, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So Jean Brokish, I'm the Midwest Program Manager with American Farmland Trust, as you mentioned. I work I work out of my home based in Champaign County, Illinois, and my role with American Farmland Trust includes providing leadership for the watershed-based projects in Illinois, as well as coordination for a partnership group, the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership, which AFT is a member of. I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, and agriculture has always been really important to me, something near and dear to my heart. I did study agriculture in college. Both I got a undergrad in agronomy from the University of Wisconsin at River Falls, and then a master's in soil science from Purdue University. And I'm just really thrilled to be working in a space and working in the Midwest, kind of my hometown area, working with farmers to implement practices and just improving agriculture here in the Midwest.
Awesome. Thanks. Emily, how about you?
Yeah, thankful for the opportunity to be here today. Emily Bruner, Midwest Science Director. I primarily kind of help to fuel and inform a lot of our programmatic work here in the Midwest with some of the most up-to-date science, providing some analysis of the outcomes of some of the work that we do, and just kind of general standby for anything that requires some scientific guidance or policy outlook on. A brief intro to me. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, born and raised, and then traveled around quite a bit and realized I was an avid explorer of nature and so much that we don't know. So I pursued a PhD in soil science in the Pacific Northwest, and then decided there's still, even though there's a lot to still be discovered around agriculture and soil and all things environmental, I realized that there's a decent gap between what we actually communicate out and building consensus around what we do know, and then helping to figure out what we don't. So I jumped back in. I did a little bit of water quality work previous to following my PhD, and then I jumped back into conservation agriculture pretty soon after I finished. And I'm based in Illinois as well.
Well, I'm so excited to have you both here today to talk about these great topics related to conservation in the Midwest. The first thing I wanted to ask you about are what are the major challenges and opportunities facing farmers in your region who are using or might want to use practices that build soil health?
Well, I think to kind of start off with some of the challenges. There are many, right? I mean, I think anytime you approach something new, if it's not your norm, there's challenges involved, right? From learning, experimenting. A lot of the things, when we kind of think about what's on some of the forefront of some of our farmer minds these days, a lot of times it's those economic constraints, right? Farmers are struggling just to make ends meet, and have been for a while now, and commodity prices are low. There's a lot of market volatility. There's also a lot of upfront costs involved with changing management practices that may not even factor into the budget, right? When you're really trying to make ends meet. You kind of layer that into, our changing climate and altered growing seasons. We have a lot more frequent and intense rainfall, which prevents a lot of spring planting days here in the Midwest. We saw that with record prevent planting in 2019. We set records for how many farmers were not able to get out into the fields and plant an insurable crop. So that's another big challenge that we're trying to navigate. And then of course there's land access, right? A lot of our farm grants, specifically in the Midwest, is rented. We've got, about 40% average nationwide. That gets up to 80% in some areas. Midwest, we're around 60%. So just being able to access that land and what that means for how much you're willing to invest in it, above and beyond, a long term. Some of those leases are only spoken, or they've been in place, with your brother or your family for a while. And so really trying to figure out what should be written and how you can kind of encourage that long-term growth and relationship is a big challenge. And then you also layer on this kind of increased pressure to combat climate change, provide environmental benefits, provide water quality. Here in the Midwest, just because we do have such a large proportion of our land in row crop agriculture. A lot of the Midwest states have developed their own nutrient loss reduction strategies because of the water pollution that has come, right? It's a non-point source issue. It's really hard to track down and remediate. And so some of those strategies kind of provide best practices that we know do help increase our water quality and some of the off-farm benefits that these practices can provide. But, just to put it kind of in context, a recent study came out within the last couple of weeks that identified hotspots just for nitrogen management practices. And 4 of those top opportunities were situated right here in the Midwest, which again is just a reflection of the predominant land use here, right? And just opportunities that we can use to kind of take advantage of better management practices in general. So there's a lot more challenges, but those are some of the major ones that we work around.
And the rented land issue is huge, right? Because just like if you're renting an apartment or a home, you're not necessarily going to put in the same level of investment as you would if you were owning it. So getting farmers to get better relationships with their landowners or even access land that they can own, I feel like is a really significant issue in making sure that conservation can be implemented at such a large scale. Jean, I'm going to ask you the same question. Before we move on, I just want to remind everyone, Emily and Jean would love to answer your questions if you have any about conservation on Midwest farms, water quality, soil health. Just put your comments in the thread of the social platform you're viewing it on, and we'll do our best to get to them. Jean, anything to add to what Emily said about challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, so I think, Emily did a great job laying out many of the challenges, and I think just kind of pivoting and framing that as an opportunity. I think, one of the things that strikes me is like this conversation is not new. Farmers have always worked really hard to make ends meet. They've continuously struggled to make a living from their land and bring the new generation into the farming operations. So really the opportunity that we see is just building resiliency into that system. And a great way to do that is really to start at the foundation by looking at the soil. And it's been encouraging, I think, because there's been a real awakening and recognition in the role that healthy soil plays in adapting to some of the challenges that Emily laid out, so weather extremes. By increasing the soil organic matter, you can really improve the ability of the soil to function. Which allows and really the function, it allows the rainfall to enter. We're not getting ponding, we're not getting runoff, or we're not getting crusting on the soil. And then the soil also has the ability to hold that water, just like a sponge. And then, increasing that soil organic matter also improves some of the soil biodiversity and nutrient cycling. So the good news, I think, really is that many of the practices that improve soil health also can address some of the economic constraints, by helping farmers increase their profitability and help them adapt to the changing climate conditions, and then offer some environmental outcomes that benefit all of us. So I know, it might just be really helpful to provide a background on soil health. That graphic that just appeared, really outlined the 4 principles of soil health, which is like minimizing disturbance, maximizing cover, maximizing biodiversity, and then maximizing the presence of living roots. So just thinking about that as soil health and how those principles and the practices that we can do to improve soil health and achieve those 4 principles. We have a little bit of information. I think there's even a graphic that talks about 2 of the most common practices related for soil health there, and that is basically cover crops, which are crops grown in the off season. So they're grown between the cash crop and they're not typically harvested. And then no-till and strip-till, which where you just reduce the amount of disturbance to the soil and you're planting directly into soil that has not been plowed after harvest. So both of those really address or really go a long ways to supporting those soil health principles.
So we got a couple of questions coming in. I want to pose one to you, and I think you'll know the answer to this one, which is why I'm going to put it up on the screen. So it's a question from Chris on YouTube. And do we have statistics on conservation practices on rented versus owned land?
We do. I don't think either Emily or I have it in our back pockets to talk about, but without having actual statistics, one of the things that I can share today, one of the things we have observed both in our work and work through some of our partners working in this space is that there is definitely evidence of like a disconnect of farmers and landowners' perceptions of each other and how and what their commitments are for those conservation practices. So we know that farmers are more likely to implement these practices on land that they own. There tends to be a perception, like I said, that the landowners aren't supportive of it, or from the landowners, they believe their farmers not supportive of it. And the whole study on non-operating landowners that American Farmland Trust completed, looking at data from 13 states, did actually confirm that yes, landowners are supportive of these practices, and in many cases, they're actually willing to work with the farmers to find ways, be it a longer lease or in some cases restructuring rental agreements to help facilitate the adoption of those practices. And so in my perspective, and I'm happy to have Emily kind of weigh in with any other data or perspective she has from it, but in my perspective, it's really just like a disconnect in terms of not having that conversation. And so encouraging like through AFT's work, but also work of our partners and people who are working with farmers, just helping them facilitate those conversations and connect the dots is really an opportunity for land that is rented.
Yeah, and I can just add that, the non-operating landowner is still kind of an elusive audience, right? So a lot of the work that AFT has kind of pioneered around that issue, because sometimes it was almost seen as taboo to get in between a landowner and their tenant, right? Because that was their own relationship. Don't want to necessarily, complicate things or intrude. But yeah, what we're finding is that the more and more that we learn about these different groups, the more and more opportunities there are to really engage those conversations. And once those conversations are engaged, it's a pretty clear path for satisfying both parties on doing better by the land generally.
And these types of practices, they're not just beneficial for the environment a lot of times, they're also beneficial to farmers' bottom line. And we actually have a question from one of our colleagues that is asking if you could talk a little bit more about the economic case studies that we've done that have sought to quantify the environmental as well as the economic benefits that farmers see when they transition to, practices that build soil health, protect water quality, et cetera.
Definitely. So we actually we've helped with the soil health case studies. We actually authored 2 specifically here in Illinois with farmers that we work with. And what we found, we did specifically look at farmers that have been successful in implementing these practices, because a lot of times we see, during transition, there's a learning curve, there's some different opportunities there. And so we targeted folks that have had, a good 4 years or so of implementing these practices and had success. And then we just said, okay, what's different? We looked at their additional costs based on these practices. And then we looked at, the additional returns on investment, whether that's through reduced inputs, yield bumps, right? There's different. But what we've found for the most part, especially here in the Midwest, one of our case studies, we had a $22 per acre increase in net income. And then another, we had, a $34 per acre increase in net income. And a lot of that came from exactly what I said, reducing those inputs and allowing the soil to kind of function and take advantage of just kind of that shift in idea from increased profitability as opposed to just increasing yield.
And you'll see the link on the bottom of the screen here. If folks are interested in learning more about these soil health case studies, they can go right here, check it out. And that's actually a pretty good segue into one of our next questions. So it's not a mystery, right, of what practices work for farmers. So I was hoping that you could talk about what practices do we know work when it comes to building soil health, and how can we better support farmers in adopting these practices?
Well, so I mentioned just briefly two of the more common practices that are suitable for the Midwest. The type of agriculture in the Midwest tends to be row crop agriculture, lots of corn and soybeans. So really just, that type of agriculture, we have the technical capacity and we have the machinery and the know-how to implement cover crops and to do some reduced tillage practices. So those are the two common ones there. And again, you really get a lot of co-benefits from those practices through soil temperature, the water management that I talked about, but also some of the nutrient cycling benefits of that. So those are really the two practices that we're emphasizing through our work. And there's been a lot of studies looking at those. But I think I want to pitch this to Emily a little bit too, because it's not as simple as just flipping a switch, and implementing those practices. There is some workload and some support that needs to go into it.
Yeah, and I think, when we think about kind of helping to support farmers, one of the things that we see time and time again, when we're actually kind of on the ground working with farmers is that they're not necessarily hearing a consistent message about the effectiveness of these practices in general, right? And what we've seen is a lot of times it only takes one bad advice or one bad year, right? Like you aerial applied your cover crop seed, you didn't get any growth, and then you're out. You don't want to mess with it again. It didn't work for you. You're not convinced, right? And
or it didn't work for your neighbor, and therefore your whole neighborhood is convinced it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and I think, going back to kind of one of the things I talked about in the beginning, as far as why I wanted to come back into the conservation space, is I think that we can all do a better job making sure that we get consistent messaging to the farmers, that these changes don't happen overnight. Let's set realistic expectations, and let's make sure that we have tailored management plans and technical assistance for each farmer, because each farmer is going to come from a different vantage point. They're going to have different needs, different systems are going to work that may not work for their neighbor, right? And so we need to do a better job of making sure that we, as a unified conservation, professional space, help to set those realistic expectations and help to provide those unique and tailored approaches so that we can enable success. Because once you've gotten through that experimental phase and you've figured out, kind of like our soil health case studies, right? Once you've figured out how these systems work for you, then you can start to remove inputs, right? Then you can start to reduce tillage passes. Then you can really see those economic returns as well. But you have to invest in the success and really reach out for the resources that you need that are tailored to your unique opportunity.
Right. It's definitely not a one size fits all approach when it comes to conservation. Farmers are different. They grow different crops. Their soil is different. Their landscapes are different. And having all of these conservation options that farmers can try and invest in and see what works and what doesn't, I think that's really valuable.
Well, I'll just add another thing, right? When you're thinking about different crops is, there's even structural barriers for some of these practices. We have farmers who are wanting to start growing wheat, right? To use it as a cover crop and also to sell it as a cash crop, but there isn't the infrastructure in the area for them to even have a market, right? To enter into. So, I mean, there's challenges we can help now, and then there's challenges we can plan for, right? As some of these ideas and opportunities take off.
So next I want to get to the opportunities, but first I just want to remind everyone watching that, this is a live conversation and we'd love to answer your questions about building resilience on Midwest farms. So if you've got anything for Jean or Emily, any questions you'd like them to answer, please just chat them into the comments thread of the social network you're viewing this on, and we'll get to them on the call if we can. So speaking of opportunities, carbon markets have been in the news lately. These are markets that seek to pay farmers for the environmental benefits that well-managed farms can provide. I was hoping that you both could talk a little bit about how these markets are developing and how they compare.
Definitely. And I guess just to kind of set the stage too, one of the things that we're figuring out as we're helping to navigate some of these opportunities for farmers is that, it's not just these new opportunities. There are multiple different programs that are coming online and that have been around, kind of thinking outside of that traditional financial assistance framework, right? A lot of times when we think about paying farmers for the work they're doing towards conservation or regenerative ag, we think about, cost share or financial assistance dollars, right? But there's also, there's price premiums that can be paid. We saw an example of that through the organic certification process, right? We're also seeing examples of that through regenerative ag programs that are coming online, where companies are starting, to pay premiums and or invest in those opportunities. We also see that there's been some success in providing a premium discount for crop insurance for growers who are implementing cover crops, right? So there's a myriad of ways that we can try to really kind of reflect some of these externalities and benefits that farmers have been providing that haven't necessarily been built into our either traditional cost share or our traditional markets. Voluntary carbon markets are gaining a lot of steam right now. Everybody wants to know how we can combat climate change, and with such a large mass of farmland, there's a large potential for us to not only build organic matter and sequester that carbon, but to provide the benefits back to farmers through payments or market opportunities. And so a lot of these markets are coming online. So, when you think about carbon markets, it's a lot of times it's an offset kind of thing where a company or an entity pays for a reduction that's going on farmland, but not necessarily reducing their own. So that's how they're kind of tackling some of these corporate, claims. But then there's also that model also exists for water quality and water quantity markets as well, right? And so there's multiple different avenues. There's either avenues for direct entry into a market, or there's avenues to work with a broker who will then take your credit, model it, and then enter the market for you. And so we decided to try to help get ahead of that and figure out some of the differences between those market opportunities that are coming online. And Jean can talk a little bit more of some of how we've navigated that space.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Yeah, so I think as we were hearing from farmers and people working with farmers, there was a lot of interest and buzz, and we just decided there was a real opportunity and a need to share some information and bring some transparency to the discussions. We'd heard from some growers that they were being contacted by some market entities and they wanted to learn more. So essentially, Emily and I had this great idea. We were going to work with some partners through the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership, as well as some organizations in neighboring states. And we co-hosted a webinar on February 12th, just about 10 days ago, that explored different ecosystem markets and it featured presentations from four prominent market entities: Indigo Ag, NORI, the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, and the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. And again, our goal with the webinar was really to create transparency and provide farmers the ability to do these like side-by-side comparison of different market opportunities. So how like when you're going shopping on a well-known online platform, you can like select different options and then put them in as a comparison table. And we actually wanted to do that like for these different markets. So we worked with those four markets, representatives from those four markets, and created a matrix table that compares and lays out the different pieces, like be it through contracting, payment structure, verification models, et cetera, so that farmers could really look at it and compare the different programs. And then we also had I think that was one of the really great outcomes of that webinar. And then another thing is, when we were working with the presenters, we had them walk the audience through their program as if they were talking to the same hypothetical farmer. So again, it created an opportunity for the audience to do that apples to apples comparison as much as possible. There was a ton of interest in the webinar. We had more than 1,000 people tuning in. hundreds of questions, like approaching 1,000 questions almost from audience members, and really just demonstrating the interest in this. And for anyone looking to view a recording of the webinar, to access any of the resources, it's all available on the website of the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership.
And so if you're a farmer and you're interested in these markets, right? Like I think probably a lot of farmers are, because you're getting paid for the environmental benefits that you've been providing for years, for generations, perhaps, that, you know, haven't resulted in more economic sustainability to your operation. So what are the considerations that you think farmers are really thinking about when they're considering whether or not these markets are something that they want to participate in, or, you know, whether they want to make that part of their kind of business plan going forward?
Well, the big thing to clarify is that if a farmer who's been doing these practices for a long time and wants to finally get some kind of retribution or repayment, right, for those services, markets aren't the place for them to go. There's an additionality requirement. So most all of the markets, again, and we kind of detailed this in our table. Most all of them, because they're based around that market structure where there's offsets, or even, you know, retirements of emissions, if you will, they're requiring that the practices be new. So we've heard from a lot of farmers saying the exact same thing that you just said, Greg. Like, well, what about me? What about all of this great work that I've been doing on my own? Where do I fit in? Which is another reason why starting to investigate some of the other opportunities and really thinking through ways that we can incentivize that continued performance is really, really important. And so, you know, building off of the webinar that we just held, we also are going to work. We brought in over 30 different organizations across the Midwest because we really wanted to go direct kind of to the horse's mouth, if you will, to get some of these answers for these markets so we could provide a really accurate information. And so we actually have a meeting coming up tomorrow where we're really going to explore within that kind of community of practice that we've assembled, what makes the most sense for us to highlight as well, right? Because we don't necessarily want to endorse one program or over another, but we do want to help farmers understand that there's, you know, the practices aren't new, but what is new is increased buzz and increased opportunity to get paid and figure out how it helps your bottom line. And so highlighting not just these market opportunities, but also maybe pay for performance models where companies are starting to inset within their own supply chain. So I think it's really important that you kind of, you know, if you just look at a market and you're like, oh, well, I've already been doing practices, so that's not for me. You know, it's kind of the same thing that goes back to the whole discouragement. You know, if you had a bad experience with implementing a practice, you're like, oh, well, thanks, but no thanks, you know? So really figuring out what opportunity makes the most sense. You also got to think, you know, if you're renting land and a market contract requires 5 to 10 year commitment, that's not in your ballpark or wheelhouse either, right? Not until you have further conversation. So there's, I guess the short answer to your question is there are a lot of considerations, and as more and more opportunities come online, we really hope to help highlight those considerations so then farmers can make the most informed choice on what makes sense for them to begin to implement these practices. And sometimes it could be that traditional cost share, right? Like if you're just starting to experiment, that traditional cost share is going to offset a lot of those upfront costs until you can kind of plan in the future and figure out, oh, well, when does it make sense for me to think about other opportunities to kind of help, you know, once I'm ready to make a full farm change. So lots of considerations.
Well, I mean, and the reason that I find environmental markets so, I guess, interesting is that it's not just good for the farmer or the family. It's a community investment, right? When farmers use these type of practices, it benefits everyone that relies on healthy soil and, you know, clean water. So it might just seem like, oh, we're just paying farmers, but it's not just about that. The benefits extend far beyond just, like I said, one farm, one piece of land. Jean, anything else to add to the markets conversation before we get to some of the great questions that we've gotten from our audience?
So I think just one other thing, there's a lot of growing interest in these markets, and it's been building for quite a while. And one kind of piece of data that I picked up from our presenters at the forum was, something like 30% of Fortune 500 companies have some sort of carbon neutral type pledge.
Mhm.
And so it's definitely corporations are making these pledges, and that's driving part of the markets. But I think it's also a lot of consumer driven interest as well. There's certainly more interest in how our food and how our products are being produced and the impacts we're having on the environment. So I think it's exciting. I don't think it's going away, but it's definitely evolving. So people are encouraged to just kind of to dive in and learn and make sure it's right for them.
And it seems like there's almost more demand for credits than there are credits available at the moment on the market.
Yeah, it's kind of like a rubber band. It stretches one way and then catches
Right.
up, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, we have a really great question from Susan from Facebook that I wanted to pose to you. So this is someone who's a landowner and who's been using 1-year leases with their tenants. And so she's interested in your advice on how long you should set a lease for to make it economic sense for a tenant to actually invest in the types of practices that we're talking about.
Emily, do you want to? I have a number in mind, but I'm curious to hear I'll put you on the spot first.
I have a list of things to think about in mind instead of a number. So maybe you go first with your number.
So I would say somewhere at least 3 years. A lot of farms we've heard from, it takes at least 3 years to really dial in your practices and even just start beginning to see some of the benefits. So 3 years minimum, 5 years would probably be better assurance for some of the farmers who are making these changes. Longer if you're comfortable with that. All of it depends, of course, on your own family dynamics and your goals for your land. But starting at 3 years minimum would be my first reaction to that.
Yeah,
Emily?
I completely agree. I like your numbers. I also think, it's one of the things that we tried to kind of set up when we're entering into, the market space and thinking about how to even, wrap your brain or navigate it is, when we think about traditional conservation planning, what's your resource concern? What are your goals? What do you want to achieve by implementing these new practices, right? Integrating that into the discussion of extending the lease is also going to help make both parties happy, right? So you make sure you're aligned on the goals that you want to see, as well as how long it may take to start reaping benefits of those goals, and who reaps the benefits in what context, right? Is it a cost share? Is it, a yield-based lease? There's all those factors too.
Great. Just reminding everyone, we've got a little bit of time still, about 10 minutes left. So if you've got any questions for Emily or Jean about soil health or conservation practices, particularly on Midwest farms, please just type those into the comment thread of the social network you're viewing on. We'll do our best to get to them. So how do we build consensus around soil health practices as a necessary component of making any farm both profitable and environmentally sustainable?
We ask ourselves that question every day. No, I think so. Hopefully we have a few answers. No, I think, first and foremost, it kind of goes back to the whole shifting that conversation away from yield, right? Mm-hmm. When thinking of kind of traditional Midwest commodity farming, it's this yield-based goal. Everything's set around a yield-based goal. But what we're learning, right, is if we're building that soil function and we're providing opportunity for the soil to provide benefits, then it becomes a matter of profitability, right? Because you're investing in your land. You're also in a position where you can reduce inputs. You can reduce tractor passes, right? You can reduce fertilizer inputs. And all of those are also going to help provide outcomes and generate opportunities for you to increase, right? So not just the reduction in inputs, but also increase your profitability through being able to provide some of those ecosystem services. So I think first and foremost, that's one way that we can really help to kind of build consensus, is really, and the case studies are a prime example of that. Like here are some real tangible examples of how farmers have made this work and how they've done it successfully, attached to some economics, so you can really see where that plays into the bottom line. Another thing that I really have found in our work to be helpful is we work with the Saving Tomorrow's Ag Resources program. It was a farmer-led effort to essentially just provide a really easy one-page form for farmers to assess where their practices are and what they can do to improve towards water quality goals. But of course, as we've mentioned, a lot of those water quality goals are very similar to soil health goals. And we've seen a lot of success in the fact that, you know, our conservation professionals as well as our farmers, they're struggling. Like, how do I even enter this space? Everything seems so overwhelming. And that program has provided an inset for us, if you will, to enter into conversations at a really easy, applicable manner. And so things like that, because you know, there are multiple sustainability platforms, there are multiple credit programs, there's all these things, but again, really being transparent and figuring out at a farm level when you're making all these other decisions, like, well, how do I even get started? You know, a program in the field form that, you know, we've done and worked on with the Saving Tomorrow's Ag Resources program is a great way that we can do that. So we can engage both the farmer and the conservation community in this really easy, simple conversation, and then build off of that conversation into, you know, a springboard, if you will, for other opportunities.
Yeah, I would add too, just kind of picking up the conversation thing. So we did talk about, you know, engaging the landowners into the conversation, but I think there's also an opportunity to engage farm advisors and retailers, CCAs, et cetera, in that conversation. And just recognizing that it's going to take multiple fronts, consistent messaging to look at that. And you know, I mentioned, or we kind of mentioned or alluded to the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership as the entity that hosted that forum. But, you know, in the Midwest, AFT is a founding member of that. And we're really using that partnership, which includes 14 other organizations all working together to promote soil health and water quality. And really collaborating and just leveraging our resources collectively, you know, sharing information, sharing resources, hosting joint workshops, et cetera, for farmers. We've really found that to be a great way to extend our reach and just help build that consensus from within the profession, people working in it, as well as reaching farmers and engaging farmers in that conversation.
All right, we got some questions streaming in here. Let me see here. Got one from another one of your Midwest colleagues here. April on Facebook is wondering why all farms matter. There's a lot of commodity farms, but also, let's see, a lot of friends and family members have a hard time understanding that small and large farms equally matter to our whole system. So I think that's an appropriate question, because at American Farmland Trust, we think, like April said, no matter how big the land is you're farming or small is, you have a part to play in the greater conservation movement. So Jean, Emily, and any thoughts on this?
Well, I think my approach has always been that there's room at the table for all of us. You know, I don't think that we accomplish anything by trying to divide or compartmentalize or compete within the agriculture sector. You know, I think that there are efficiency of scale or economy of scale, I guess, that can be achieved with some crops that I think is really important and needs to happen. And then there's also just really, you know, great human connections and community buy-in that can happen with the local CSA. You know, so I think all of that is important to a vibrant and resilient food system.
Great. So we've had a couple of questions from landowners that have been interested in how to find farmers that are interested in adopting conservation practices on the land that this person owns. Are there resources in the Midwest for landowners that are looking to connect with farmers who, you know, are interested in these practices?
There are multiple different platforms that exist. I'm not thinking of any off the top. Jean, do you know? I've got a couple in mind, but I'm having a hard time pinning down the exact names.
Well, there is, I just toss out, I think there's a land connection. And I think there's also like the Idea Farm Network, which is just sort of a Google group that
Sure.
is really operating around regenerative agriculture. And occasionally you'll see like there's an opportunity to rent land, or I'm looking for a farmer with this kind of philosophy. I don't feel like there's a really good comprehensive clearinghouse that exists in the Midwest, like there does in some, maybe in the New England area.
Sure.
And so, but I do think that it is on our radar, and it is something that we've talked about in terms of using the STAR tool as a way to kind of highlight farmers implementing these practices and advertise and use that almost as like a dating service. If you want a 4-star farmer, this is where you need to go to manage your land.
I love that.
Yeah, and we have examples of working through that program where that exact relationship building has happened, right? Where we've had folks reach out to our STAR coordinator or some of our STAR program folks and say, I'm a landowner, I'm interested in getting a 3 or 4-star farmer. Can you provide me with some of those resources? And so that's definitely a niche that program is able to fill, and that we're hoping to kind of build out as we build the program.
So we're getting towards the end of our time today, so I wanted to give you both a chance for any final words. So the folks that are watching this either live now or who are going to watch it after, they're interested in conservation in the Midwest. So anything you want to say about, where AFT's work is headed, what the opportunities are, anything that you're particularly excited about? Final words, Emily, how about you first?
I'm excited about everything that I do. I think it's as one of the STAR program folks says, it's a great time to be in conservation. And I think it's important, though, that we remember that, again, these practices aren't new. The approach to taking care of the land isn't new. What's changing is our understanding, right? Our understanding of how these practices can actually affect some of these ecosystem services, and just keeping in mind as our knowledge and our scientific research, comes on board for us to really kind of fit some of these pieces together, right? Like thinking about soil health, thinking about the effectiveness of practices to, keep soil in place, as well as provide ecosystem services, that we just need to be patient with each other and make sure that we're pushing out consistent and realistic messages, right? One of the reports that AFT just did that I had the pleasure of being a part of was on affirming the technical capacity of cover crops and no-till, to combat climate change. And a lot of that work was based on, hey, we do know that these practices work, and we are seeing alignment within models and field studies of just how effective they can be in helping that. So I just think, I encourage everyone to continue to add to the conversation and make sure that we're incorporating the best available knowledge that we have and getting that out in a consistent format to farmers who really need it as they're making changes.
Jean, last words.
So Emily mentioned patience, which was one word that was in my mind too. I think just recognizing that it took us a long time to get where we are. It's going to take us some time to kind of move back and continue to make improvements. I think the other thing is that I didn't coin this phrase, but I think I picked it up from one of the things, like not every practice is right for every farm, but every farm is right for at least one practice. So I think just trying to find the right conservation practice for your situation, and we can really make progress collectively through that.
Thank you so much for joining us today, both of you. I'm just going to flash your contact information up on the screen real quick in case folks are interested in sending you an email and learning more. So we've got Jean's contact right here. We got Emily's contact right here. I just wanted to let everyone know that we've got another free range conversation live stream coming up next week with our California office. It's going to be a really good conversation. So we're going to be talking about the urban-rural connection, bridging the gap in California. And so we're going to be digging into how the interconnectedness of our food and farming systems can tear down the walls we've built around conversations in agriculture. California is in many ways a microcosm for the entire state. It has divides, but also a lot of things that bring us together. So that's going to be the conversation next week. And I'm just going to flash a little bit up. We'll have our AFT regional director, Kara Heckard, and I think we'll also have a guest from outside of AFT that's working on these issues this time. We'll send around more information to everyone in the coming week. Thank you so much for joining us today. If we didn't get to your questions during the call, we'll do our best to go into the discussion threads and answer them. Thanks again for joining us for Free Range Conversations with American Farmland Trust. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.